There was an article that was purported to have been written by her in one of the magazine, one of the Star or whatever those terrible things are, in which she made certain assertions and accusations that none of us ever believed a word.
There are television endings that feel like a warm embrace, the kind that leave you sitting on your couch with a lump in your throat and a smile on your face, grateful that you were there to witness something genuinely beautiful. And then there are endings that feel like someone knocked over the cake at a birthday party and tried to pretend it never happened. Happy Days, one of the most beloved sitcoms in American television history, somehow managed to deliver both in the same year. The same show that gave audiences one of the most emotionally resonant finales ever broadcast also became the cautionary tale that every network executive still whispers about when scheduling meetings goes sideways. This is a story of how a single scene, a moment so quietly powerful it made millions of Americans cry in their living rooms, was nearly erased from television history by the very network that created it, and how the decisions made in 1984 echo through Hollywood to this very day. To understand what went wrong, you first have to understand what Happy Days meant to America. When the show premiered in January of 1974, it arrived at exactly the right moment. The country was tired. Watergate had hollowed out public trust. The Vietnam War had fractured generation, and Americans were hungry for something uncomplicated and warm. Happy Days offered exactly that. Set in 1950s Milwaukee, it followed the Cunningham family, led by the dependable hardware store owner Howard Cunningham, his cheerful wife Marion, and their son Richie, navigating the innocent world of sock hops, drive-in movies, and teenage heartbreak. It was nostalgia as medicine, and the country took its dose faithfully every week. Ron Howard, who played Richie Cunningham, was the anchor of the show in its early years. He was the kind of actor who made you believe in the character completely, an all-American kid with an honest face and a natural warmth that translated effortlessly through the television screen. But as the show moved into its third and fourth seasons, something unexpected happened. A leather-jacketed supporting character named Arthur Fonzarelli, played by Henry Winkler, began pulling audiences away from the main story like a magnet. The Fonz was everything Richie wasn't. Cool where Richie was awkward, confident where Richie was uncertain, and magnetic in a way that made viewers lean forward every time he walked into Arnold's Drive-In. By the mid-'70s, Fonzie was no longer a supporting character. He was a show. Merchandise bearing his image flew off store shelves. Kids across the country practiced his signature, i.e. in school hallways. Barbers reported a surge in requests for his slick-back hairstyle. Henry Winkler was receiving more fan mail than any other cast member, and network executives at ABC began doing what network executives always do when they smell money. They started rearranging the furniture. The most notorious of these executive ideas was a proposal to rename the show Fonzie's Happy Days. On a spreadsheet, it probably looked like brilliant branding. In reality, it was the first sign that ABC didn't fully understand what it had. Ron Howard, then just 21 years old, responded with a kind of directness that young actors rarely show toward the people writing their paychecks. He told the network plainly that at the title change, he was walking off the show. No negotiations, no compromises. Henry Winkler, to his immense credit, stood beside Howard. He told executives that his own success depended entirely on the ensemble around him, that Fonzie's cool only worked because it bounced off Richie's sincerity and the warmth of the Cunningham household. The title stayed, but the fact that the conversation ever happened revealed something important. ABC viewed Happy Days as a product to be marketed rather than a story to be honored. That attitude would return with devastating consequences. By 1983, Happy Days had been running for nearly a decade. The show had weathered cast changes, shifting cultural tastes, and the inevitable decline in ratings that comes when any long-running series starts feeling familiar rather than fresh. Ron Howard had already departed to pursue his directing career, a transition that proved spectacularly successful and which, in retrospect, probably saved him from being permanently defined by Richie Cunningham. The show continued without him, but the energy was different. Everyone involved knew the end was approaching. Creator Gary Marshall, the man who had built Happy Days from the ground up, began thinking seriously about how to close the chapter. Marshall was not a sentimental man, in the Hollywood sense of the word, meaning he wasn't interested in sentiment for its own sake. But he understood storytelling deeply, and he understood audiences even more deeply. He knew that the viewers who had invested 11 years in the Cunningham family deserved something more than a standard television goodbye. He wanted the finale to do something that television almost never did: acknowledge the relationship between the show and the people watching it. His idea was deceptively simple. In the final scene of the series finale, Howard Cunningham, the father figure at the heart of the show, would turn and look directly at the camera. He would speak to the audience, not as a character delivering lines, but as a presence that shared a family's life with millions of strangers for 11 years. This concept, known technically as breaking the fourth wall, was considered genuinely radical for American network television in the early 1980s. Television operated on the unspoken contract that viewers were peering through an invisible window into another world. Characters existed in their own reality. The idea that one of them might look back through the glass and speak directly to the person watching from their couch was seen as a violation of that contract. ABC executives were not pleased. In meetings that, by multiple accounts, became genuinely tense, network representatives pushed back hard against Marshall's plan. Their concerns were not entirely without logic. Happy Days had spent 11 seasons building the Cunningham world as a believable, lived-in place. Millions of viewers had developed genuine emotional attachments to these characters. The fear was that having Howard suddenly acknowledge the camera would feel jarring and cheap, like a magician explaining his tricks at the end of the show. Executives worried it would undermine everything the series had built and leave audiences feeling manipulated rather than moved. Marshall disagreed. He had been fighting network instincts his entire career, and he had usually been right. He argued that the Cunningham family had become so deeply embedded in American life that a conventional ending would feel inadequate. Happy Days wasn't just a show that people watched. It was something they had lived alongside. Richie's teenage years had overlapped with viewers' own memories of growing up. Fonzie's swagger had given a generation of young people a version of cool to admire. Howard and Marion's steady, loving marriage had modeled something that millions of American families recognized and cherished. To end that with a simple fade, the black felt like letting the audience down. On May 8, 1984, the series finale of Happy Days, titled Passages, aired on ABC. The episode was built around significant emotional milestones. Joni and Chachi, after years of courtship and a failed spinoff, finally got engaged. Fonzie, the eternal bachelor, did something no one expected. He adopted a young boy named Danny, bringing the character's long emotional journey to a quietly beautiful conclusion. The Cunningham household was full of the kind of warmth and celebration that had made the show special in its best years. And then came the moment Gary Marshall had fought for. Tom Bosley, who had played Howard Cunningham for 11 seasons with general reliability that made him one of television's great unsung performers, turned to face the camera. The studio audience went quiet. Bosley, speaking in Howard's steady, unhurried voice, delivered a monologue that has since become one of the most quoted farewells in television history. He spoke about his children growing up and starting lives of their own, about the quiet satisfaction of a life well lived, about the particular joy of watching love pass from one generation to the next. And then he addressed the audience directly, thanking them for being part of the family across all those years, and raising a toast to Happy Days. The reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Viewers across the country wept openly, not because the scene was melodramatic or manipulative, but because it was the opposite of those things. It was quiet, honest, and specific in a way that only truly great television writing manages to be. Howard Cunningham wasn't delivering a speech. He was having conversation with the people who had invited him into their homes every week for over a decade, and he was saying thank you in the most dignified way possible. Critics who had initially been skeptical of the fourth wall device quickly revised their opinions when they saw the audience response. Letters poured into ABC in the days following the finale, with viewers describing the scene as one of the most moving things they had ever seen on television. Television journalists who covered the finale noted that Marshall had somehow done the impossible. He had made the artificial feel real, made the performative feel genuine, and made the ending of a sitcom feel like the closing of something that had actually mattered. The scene that ABC executives had fought to prevent became the most praised moment of the entire 11-season run. If the story of Happy Days ended there, It would be a story of triumph, a beloved show, a creator who fought for his vision, a network that was wrong but ultimately got out of the way, and a finale that delivered genuine emotional grace. But television history is rarely that clean, and the story of Happy Days is particularly messy in its final chapter. Earlier in 1984, ABC had secured exclusive broadcast rights to the Winter Olympics in Sarajevo. The games ran from early to mid-February, and the network cleared its primetime schedule to accommodate wall-to-wall Olympic coverage. This was a significant business decision, and it came with significant consequences for every show that was bumped from its regular slot. Happy Days, already in its final season, had several episodes scheduled to air in February that were never broadcast because of the Olympic displacement. The network faced a straightforward choice. They could delay the series finale until later in the year to ensure all episodes aired in their intended order, or they could keep the finale schedule for May and figure out what to do with the leftover episodes afterward. ABC chose the second option, and in doing so, they made one of the most damaging decisions in the history of American television scheduling. The series finale aired on May 8th as planned. Tom Bosley delivered his farewell. Audiences said goodbye. The Cunningham family was put to rest with genuine tenderness and craft. And then, over the following summer and into the fall, ABC quietly began airing the displaced episodes. 5 of them, scattered across June, July, August, and September of 1984, landing on television screens like uninvited guests at a party that had already ended. The first of these post-finale episodes aired just weeks after May farewell, and the reaction from viewers was one of genuine bewilderment. People who had already processed the end of the show, who had already moved through the emotional experience of saying goodbye to a series that had been part of their lives for over a decade, suddenly found the Cunningham family back on their screens, as if nothing had happened. The emotional logic of the farewell was shattered. The closure that the finale had so carefully constructed simply ceased to exist. Each subsequent episode made the situation worse. These were not special installments designed to add meaning or context. They were routine episodes, the kind of light-hearted, inconsequential half-hours that a long-running show produces in its final season as it winds down. On their own, in their proper place in the broadcast sequence, they would have been unremarkable. Aired after the finale, they felt like a cruel joke, like someone reopening a wound that had just barely healed. The last of these 5 episodes, which aired on September 24th, 1984, was called Fonzie Spots. The plot involved Fonzie attempting to join Howard's Leopard Lodge, a recurring fraternal organization in the show, and being subjected to hazing and mockery by Potsy, one of his closest friends. There was no emotional resonance, no meaningful character development, no sense that the writers had any awareness they were producing what would ultimately become the final image of Happy Days in broadcast history. The Fonz, who had been given one of the most unexpectedly moving send-offs in the proper finale, was reduced to being the butt of a joke. That became the last frame that television audiences ever saw of Happy Days in its original run. Consider what that meant for the show's legacy in practical terms. A viewer who had watched every episode of Happy Days in order, who had wept at Tom Bosley's farewell speech in May, who had felt the satisfying emotional closure of Joni and Chachi's engagement and Fonzie's adoption of young Danny, would have their final memory of the show overwritten by an episode about hazing rituals at a fictional lodge. The careful emotional architecture that Gary Marshall had spent months constructing was not just damaged, it was demolished. Network executives in the years and decades that followed acknowledged, when pressed, that the decision to air those 5 episodes after finale was a mistake. But acknowledgement after the fact does nothing to repair the experience of the millions of viewers who lived through it in real time. Television is not like film or literature, where you can return to the definitive text and experience the intended ending whenever you choose. Television is a shared cultural experience that happens in real time, and when that experience is disrupted, the disruption becomes part of the memory. The fallout from ABC's scheduling decision extended well beyond the immediate confusion of the summer of 1984. In the years that followed, as television entered a new era of sophisticated storytelling and increasingly protected relationships between creators and their audiences, the Happy Days finale disaster became a reference point for what not to do. Writers and producers who had watched the show's legacy fracture in real time began pushing for contractual protections that would prevent networks from interfering with the series' ending. The concept of finale protection, the guarantee that a show's concluding episode would remain the concluding episode regardless of scheduling complications, became a serious industry conversation in the mid to late 1980s, driven in significant part by what had happened to Happy Days. The cast carried the weight of the mishandled ending in different ways. Ron Howard had already moved on by the time the post-finale episodes aired, and his directing career insulated him from the worst of it. When he looked back at his Happy Days years, he could focus on what the show had meant rather than how it had ended, and his subsequent work gave him a legacy that stood entirely independent of the Cunningham household. Henry Winkler's experience was more complicated. The Fonz had made him one of the most recognizable faces in America, but that recognition became a trap. The very qualities that made Fonzie iconic, the leather jacket, the motorcycle, the effortless cool, made it nearly impossible for casting directors to imagine Winkler in any other context. For years after Happy Days ended, his career stalled. He worked steadily, but without the cultural impact that his talent deserved. And knowing that the show's final image was Fonzie spots, rather than the genuinely moving adoption scene from the proper finale, added an extra layer of frustration to the whole experience. The character he had poured himself into for a decade deserved a better last frame than the one ABC gave it. Tom Bosley, who delivered the speech that deserved to close the entire run, continued working consistently in television to the following decades. But the speech he gave in passages remained the defining moment of his career in the public memory, which tells you something important. Audiences knew which ending was real, even if the network had confused the broadcast order. When Bosley passed away in 2010, the tributes were dominated by the image of Howard Cunningham looking into the camera and saying thank you. People remembered the right ending. They just had to work around the network's interference to find it. What makes the finale scene so durable, even decades after the confusion of those post-finale episodes, is the quality of what Gary Marshall created and Tom Bosley delivered. The fourth wall break works because it was earned. 11 seasons of consistent storytelling, of genuine character development, of a family presented with enough warmth and specificity to feel real, had built an audience whose attachment to the Cunninghams was not casual. These were not just characters that people watched. They were presences that families had invited into their homes across more than a decade, through childhood and adolescence and early adulthood and parenthood. And the idea that one of those presences might turn and acknowledge that relationship was not strange at all. It was, in retrospect, exactly right. The writers and producers of later television series learned from this. The willingness to break the fourth wall in a finale, to acknowledge the audience directly and honor the relationship between the show and its viewers, has appeared in numerous series endings since 1984. Some of these moments have worked brilliantly. Others have felt forced or derivative. The difference, almost always, comes down to whether the gesture was earned by the years of storytelling that preceded it, and whether the execution had the particular quietness and sincerity that Bosley brought to Howard Cunningham's farewell toast. Shouting thank you at an audience is very different from looking them in the eye and meaning it. The scene also had a specific cultural context that gave it extra resonance. Happy Days was, at its core, a show about American optimism. It was set in the 1950s deliberately, in a period that audiences associated with stability and innocence, even if that association was partly mythological. The show had been a comfort object for a country going through difficult years, and Howard Cunningham's gentle, steady presence had been part of that comfort. When he turned to the camera in the finale and said that a man or woman couldn't ask for anything more than to raise good children and watch love pass to the next generation, he was articulating a version of the American dream that felt genuinely modest and genuinely true. It wasn't a grand statement. It was a quiet one. And quiet, true things are almost always more moving than loud ones 40 years after the original broadcast. In 2024, the 50th anniversary of Happy Days brought the surviving cast back together for a moment that many observers described as the real goodbye the show had never properly been given. At the Emmy Awards, Ron Howard and Henry Winkler walked out together, older and carrying the accumulated weight of 50 years of American life, and recreated the legendary Fonzie jukebox moment. Winkler struck the machine. The theme song played. The audience in the auditorium filled with industry professionals who knew exactly what they were watching, erupted in a response that was equal parts nostalgia and genuine affection. Critics noted that this moment accomplished something the 1984 broadcast schedule had prevented. It gave the show a final image that matched the dignity of Tom Bosley's speech. Two men who had spent their young adulthood inside the world of the Cunninghams, standing together on a stage and reminding an audience of what the show had meant, was a better last frame than anything the network had provided. It didn't erase the post-finale episodes or undo the scheduling confusion of that strange summer, but it gave the legacy of Happy Days something that had been missing for 4 decades, a conclusion that felt like conclusion. The scene that took Happy Days off the air for good was not Fonzie spots, though that was the last episode ABC broadcast. The scene that truly ended the show, that completed an emotional arc and gave its audience the farewell they deserved, was Tom Bosley looking into a camera in May of 1984 and saying thank you for being part of the family. Everything that followed was noise, the kind of institutional confusion that happens when a corporation treats storytelling as a scheduling problem rather than human experience. What remains, stripped of all the network decisions and broadcast order confusion and Emmy retrospectives, is the image of a man who played a father for 11 years, honoring the people who had treated that fictional family as their own.